Don't let bad lighting ruin your videos. As a content creator, filmmaker, YouTuber, TikTok, whatever you do, wherever you do it, lighting is fundamental and core to how you create videos. So it's super, super important to understand the basics of what makes good lighting, and it's also super important to understand what you shouldn't be doing and what kind of mistakes you may be making right now. So in today's video, I'm gonna be talking about the top 5 lighting mistakes that all content creators, filmmakers, videographers make, whether you're a beginner or whether you've been doing it for years and you're super advanced at it. There's kind of something for everyone in this, and there might be stuff that you're doing right now that you had no idea makes any difference whatsoever, but it does. So without further ado, let's get into number 1. The first mistake that people make when it comes to video lighting is not using the proper diffusion or not using any diffusion at all. When it comes to diffusion, there's very few situations where you don't want to be using some type of diffusion modifier, something to soften the light that you're using and make it less harsh on your subject or whoever, whatever you're lighting. There are certain situations where yes, you want a harsh light, you want a hard light, you want a point light on something, but for the most part, diffusion is key in just about everything when it comes to videos, content creation, all that stuff. So there's a whole bunch of different types of diffusion, different materials, different strengths, all kinds of different stuff. But ultimately what it comes down to is how much light is being let through the material that you're shooting the light through. The thicker or stronger the material is, the more light is going to be lost and it's not going to be going through. Therefore, the softer the light is going to be. Typically, a very standard piece of diffusion is going to be some type of grid material or silk material. You'll see this on a lot of different types of soft boxes, light domes, all kinds of stuff. We're actually using a Aperture Light Dome 2 right now that has a grid on it. So diffusion just generally makes light look nicer, makes it look softer, and it also just spreads that light out a little bit more evenly so that it's not focused on one part of a subject, a person, whatever you're filming. If you really want to DIY it, you can go to Target or Walmart or Home Depot and get a cheap $10 shower curtain and use that material. Put it up on a stand, tape it up somewhere, point a light through it, and that's gonna be a really nice diffusion material. We actually have some of that in our kits where it's kind of a last resort where we're on shoots, we forget diffusion, and we pull out the shower curtain and it gets the job done. So it really just is about softening the light that you're using and kind of spreading out the focus and the beam of it to disperse over a larger area. As you go deeper down the rabbit hole of diffusion, you can also look into rags of different types. Rags are basically the diffusion materials, typically in squares of different sizes. So you can get a 6 foot by 6 foot rag, an 8 foot by 8 foot rag, 12 foot, 20 foot, so on and so forth. And so basically that is really good for large scale productions, large scenes, where you need a lot of diffusion material. And you can even use it outside. If you're doing an outdoor interview, you need to throw up a 12-foot diffusion material to diffuse the sun. It definitely gets the job done depending on what the material is. The bottom line with diffusion is you need to be using it. A key light by itself without any type of diffusion is not gonna cut it. It's not gonna look good for your videos. And just because you have a light in front of you does not mean that it is the right choice or it's going to look nice. Diffusion is key. Number 2 is color temperature and white balance. A lot of times we see people that are either not balancing their camera's white balance properly or they're using the wrong color temperature of light for the situation. Typically what you want to do with white balance is make sure your camera's set to 5600 Kelvin. That's kind of a standard baseline for daylight color temperature. Pretty normal, it's what most things are shot on. The other component of that is you want to make sure that the light matches that. So 5600 Kelvin is great on your camera as long as the key light is also 5600 Kelvin. If you have a very warm key light, or let's say you're using like a light bulb or something like that that isn't properly color balanced, then it really won't help you out if your camera's white balance is 5600. So make sure that you are using the right color temperature of lights and that it is balanced properly on your camera's white balance. Most professional or prosumer lights that you're going to get for video typically are going to be daylight. So with Aperture, for instance, they classify it by D. So you could look at a 120D, a 300D, 600D, so on and so forth. And the D basically means daylight, which is that 5600. When you get into bicolor, For aperture, it's gonna be X. So it's basically gonna say you can balance it from 3200 Kelvin to 7500 Kelvin and somewhere around there. And basically you can control for your environment or the background. So if you want a warmer look, a cooler look, then you're able to change the color temperature of the light to account for that. Another thing that people can utilize with color temperature that most don't is to account for mood. Color has a huge influence on mood and how something is perceived when somebody watches it. So color temperature on a light is a great and easy way to quickly change the mood of the video and how you want people to feel when they watch it. Typically warm is more welcoming, so when you're down to 3200, 4400, something like that, and then cooler as you go up to 56, 75, then that's gonna be a little bit colder, maybe a little bit dark, suspenseful, whatever. So it's a great way to quickly convey mood. I would highly recommend, if you have the budget for it, to get a bicolor light so that way you can kind of adjust your color temperature based on what you're trying to convey. The third tip I have is to stop using your overhead lights to light your video. I don't care if you're filming it in your bedroom or a studio, the overhead lights that are just typically on in a normal room are not going to look good on a video. Oftentimes they're all kinds of different color temperatures, intensities, all sorts of stuff, not to mention they're directly above you, so it creates this raccoon eye effect that just doesn't look good. To do it right, you want to use purposeful lighting in specific places and turn off the house lights or kill them. Killing the house lights overall just gives you way more control when it comes to lighting and how you want your image and video to look. When the house lights are on, you lose a lot of that control and ability to shift and manipulate the image that you're shooting. Now, I know it's really easy to just keep the house lights on and not light your image properly, but spending that little bit of extra time up front is really going to help your video look a lot better. And if your image looks too dark when the house lights are off, there's another solution to that. And that brings us to point number 4. Point number 4 is to use and take advantage of background light. So going from point number 3, if you kill the house lights, a lot of times it can look too dark or your image can look underexposed. The solution to that is by having a background light of some type to give and boost up the light coming from the background of your image behind whatever you're filming. If you have the ability to use multiple lights and not just one key light, I would highly recommend utilizing another light pointed at the ceiling, pointed at a wall, whatever, just to give your image a little bit more depth and also to add exposure to the back of your image. By killing house lights, you are losing a lot of light and exposure, and so you do have to account for that. So for this image, for instance, we have a key light over here, which is an aperture 300D with the light dome like I mentioned in the beginning that we're using, but just that alone is not gonna cut it for us. We are losing a lot of light in the background, even though we have the windows over here. And so to account for that, we have another 300D down on the floor, pointed at the ceiling, that's just giving a general fill and giving a little boost to the exposure in the background. Now, don't get me wrong, for certain images, certain looks, a really dark, moody background is what's needed, but it has to be purposeful. Most of the time when you're lighting a video, you're probably not trying to go for a super dark, moody feel. And so that's where a background light comes in. Some type of light, whether it's just a light bulb or it's a high-powered video production light, something to give a boost to the back of your image, to add that depth, add those dynamics, and also just make it look a little bit more natural and not feel like it's just a super dark image where you turned off the lights in your bedroom or whatever. The other side of this is if you're shooting around windows, then you can also utilize that natural light to give a natural bright background fill. If you don't have another light, if you're only working with one key light, then I would highly recommend getting close to a window and letting that natural sunlight fill in the exposure for what would otherwise be another light lighting the background. The last point I'll talk about, kind of segueing from point number 4, is sometimes you have too much natural exposure and you have to be able to fight that and account for that. So no matter how bright the lights that you are working with are, there's nothing that is brighter than the sun. And so it's important to learn how to work with the sun and not against the sun. So whether you're filming outside, doing an outdoor interview, or you're filming in a room with a lot of large windows, sunlight coming in, it's important to understand how to manipulate the sunlight and how to have it work for you, not against you. Going back to the first point with diffusion, if you're outside doing an outdoor interview, a lot of times you can actually use the sunlight to your advantage, throw up a piece of diffusion, have the sunlight either shine through it or bounce it against against a whiteboard or a beadboard or something like that and get a nice either key or fill light that is way more diffused than what the sunlight would be on its own. What you don't want, unless it's very intentional, is direct, harsh sunlight on whatever you're filming. The other thing to discuss with sunlight is when you're shooting inside and you're shooting against a window like we are now, it's really important to account for the exposure outside before you start lighting your image and how you want it to look. So the other thing that I would recommend is once you get your camera set up and you get your angle all dialed in and you have a window in the background, make sure to balance that exposure to whatever the window exposure is at and the sunlight that's coming in is at. Once that's all set up, you can figure out, all right, do we have enough power in terms of lighting to balance that out and account for that and have a subject come in and still be properly lit, or do we not have enough light? In this case, what we did is balance for the outside exposure and figured out that we just need a single 300D with diffusion on it, and it's at 100% and it's providing enough light. In a lot of situations, that's not gonna cut it, and you're gonna need a lot more power to balance the outside light. If you don't have that power, if you don't have that light, and there's just way too much exposure coming in from outside, then what I would recommend is to not shoot against a window. The other thing you can do is turn around completely and shoot away from a window, utilize that sunlight that's coming in as assistance to the key light and just additional light to help light your subject. What you don't want to do is just ignore it, leave it as is, and have a super blown out image in your background. It doesn't look good. So there's my top 5 tips on how to avoid these mistakes in video lighting. Hope you guys found this helpful. If you want to learn more about some of the lights that we use, I'll link one of those videos here. And with that, I'll see you guys next time.